Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Welcome back to more Live from the Heartland. I'm Michael James here in Chicago, and it really brings me a lot of pleasure, honestly and truly, to bring in our next guest, the one and only Thom Clark, who many of you know has been a host on this show, a co-producer of the show, and someone that I like to go to for information because he thinks out a lot of stuff and has a lot to share. And we've been talking about him coming on for a while. He's involved in this race and equity project, which he'll tell us about. But given the status of the world and the crisis that is unfolding in the Middle East, as well as some stuff right in our face here at home, we're going to talk about a few things first. So without further ado, as some people used to say, hi, Thom, how are you?
Good day to you, Michael. I'm doing fine, thank you.
Good to see you, brother. Well, we're going to talk about the Race and Equity Project, which you have been involved with and want to share about. But the news hit us last week pretty heavy, what's unfolding in the Middle East. We've been longtime supporters of a better deal for Palestinian people, but the horrendous killing of civilians and stuff has really shaken up a lot of people. What's your take on Israel-Palestine conflict these days? How do we get into this mess?
Well, as I reflected with some of my family some 50 years ago when I was a junior at Loyola's Rome Center, I took off a semester early and actually spent 2 weeks on a kibbutz in northern Israel. As a practicing Catholic, also got to visit the Holy Land. And was very well treated by the settlers in that pretty small kibbutz. Felt I had studied up on Israel, and this is like 3 years after the Six-Day War, which was still very much fresh in people's mind. And our friends both here and in Israel refer to this as their 9/11. It's clearly been a shock what Hamas did, but I think as I review the media coverage, I've also been shocked at how one-sided the coverage has been, because there's a long arc of history behind this conflict. And while I'm not making any excuses for Hamas and their horrific actions, similar actions have been taking place by the government, not by Israelis themselves, but by the government, particularly in regards to the West Bank, as well as isolating the Gaza Strip. There are international agreements that Hamas once agreed to create a two-state solution to this ongoing historical 100 years old battle over who owns that piece of land. And the fact is, many faiths have a legitimate hold on that piece of land, as well as the Dome of the Rock itself, which has been the probably immediate cause, along with the actions of the current government, for this current conflict. And I don't know how we're going to get out of it, because now there are massive civilian casualties happening across the Gaza Strip in the name of retaliation. And I don't think retaliation ever gets us very far. And certainly civilians get caught up in it, whatever side they might have been on. They're not combatants. UN today suggested that Israel has already committed some war crimes in the cutting off electricity, food, and medicine for hospitals that were already poorly supplied because of the de facto blockade of the Gaza Strip for many years now. So I find myself thinking about the ongoing conflict in Northern Ireland, which everyone thought was irresolvable, with the IRA killing British soldiers and vice versa. And yet a Good Friday Accord was finally negotiated there, thanks to President Clinton and his agent, George Mitchell. And I guess I'll leave with a rhetorical. I don't know who our George Mitchell is going to be today to help resolve this, because the sides seem to be pretty well entrenched, both within that land itself, as well as our government's response. The European Union's response seems to be a little more split in terms of recognizing the rights of Palestinians to survive. And I just think the next few days and weeks are going to be very brutal for both sides, because I don't see anyone quite giving in and ready to shake a hand of peace, which is really what is called for right now.
You know, I think it's going to be a setback for a better deal for Palestinians. I mean, I think that that was sort of on the horizon. Things were moving in a good direction. I think that that's really on the back burner right now. I did at the beginning of the show read a quote from Matt Duss, D-U-S-S, who was a political aide to Bernie Sanders, where at the end he said, he really talked, he says, that does not mean we can't have a deeper conversation about the context of the situation, Israel, Palestine. We have to have that conversation. But I think the way into that conversation has to be very clear about principles of civilian protection and very clear on how disgusting this violence is.
I couldn't agree more. A short story. I was so incensed at what I saw as one-sided coverage on the initial Saturday night coverage on WGN, which I watch all the time. I wrote the reporter and explained my position, my history, my general knowledge of what's going on both sides. And she actually wrote back and thanked me for my comments and apologized for not deliberately showing bias, but in the moment of deadline reporting, didn't know much about the other side. And so I have fed her information since from our colleague Marilyn Katz, who you had on last week, and others, Ray Hanania. And I don't know what she's going to do with that, but she again thanked me for each dispatch I sent her. And it just reminded me that particularly younger reporters covering this have editors kind of framing the story for them, and they may not know better about the history that you and I have lived with so long and have maybe studied a bit more than some people. And it's, the lesson I took from this is don't yell at the TV, do something about it. And
I yell at the TV a lot.
but I think maybe we need to write letters more often and see what kind of a response we can get from the reporters and editors who are covering the news for us.
Yeah, I'm not going to belabor it, but I was kind of amazed at how I think the news has even turned more to a totally pro-Israel stance, which I can understand given we learned more about the violence and how it came down. But initially, I found the only place I saw anything that even raised the historical issues was MSNBC, and I haven't seen much of that for the last few days.
Well, I'm afraid I agree with you, and we'll see how much of a bigger story evolves over time. But I again recall 9/11, which is the illusion or the metaphor that many Israelis are using right now. There was tremendous anti-Muslim sentiment right after that horrific act of terror. And, I think that has dissipated over time, but it's not disappeared. We have a former president who began his election campaign on the premise that we should get rid of all Muslims. And I'm not paraphrasing too much when I say that. So we have these tensions beyond just the land of Palestine and what the Israeli government might be doing about it right now, that we need to all be looking at how we move beyond that kind of conflict and disdain for other peoples and begin to represent basic humanity.
Thom, I'm going to switch gears here because I'm sure we're going to be talking about the Middle East every show for a while. Let's bring it home to Chicago, where we've long been a welcoming city. We've welcomed immigrants from all over the world. We've continued to do that. But all of a sudden, we have certain aldermen starting to question our sister city relationship, our sister country relationship. We have talk of putting migrants in tents. We have people in certain communities basically sowing seeds of not in my backyard, without really being clear that they have been deprived of some promises about better schools, better housing, things in their neighborhood. What's your take on the migrants coming to Chicago and the reaction to it here in the city?
Well, we now have had over 17,000 migrants arrive since last year. And that means the problem is close to doubling since Mayor Johnson took over. He did take over a situation that the former mayor had not really prepared the city very well for. If we had been doing something last spring, we maybe could have rehabbed some of the empty buildings around town to provide the kind of housing, which certainly is one suggestion Alderman Vasquez, for instance, has made. But we have an immediate problem right now with over 2,000 people, again, in police stations. sleeping on the floor, sleeping in tents outside police stations, and it's getting colder. Um, I'm not even sure that they can get tents up that quick, if that's the solution, which I don't particularly agree with, particularly with the company that got hired to do it. Um, and to be honest, I blame uh, the administration for being a little flat-footed, but also relying on the state that originally signed the contract with this firm that has a shady past, by my estimation. So I think that Brandon Johnson has an almost insurmountable issue to overcome in a few short weeks before we start seeing freezing migrants out on the street. And that's not to count the existing homeless and other folks who are doubling up, who aren't officially called homeless, because the city clearly has a significant affordable housing issue that's exacerbated by the ever increasing cost of rent, and for that matter, home ownership, which is just spiraling. The mayor is making his budget statement as we speak today, and we'll see how he's going to resolve fulfilling some of the promises he made. Although I've begun to hear a lot more talk about you can't solve everything in one year's budget. I have 4 to work with. So I don't think supporters of the mayor are going to be entirely happy with what they hear in his budget statement. He has a now $500 million deficit to somehow fill in, and 200 million of that is what the migrant crisis has cost the city so far. Totally unbudgeted, unprepared for, and it's not clear without further help from the state or the feds how we're going to fill that gap. Ultimately, on the migrant issue, this is a cry out for the need for comprehensive immigration reform, which we've been talking about for 10 or 20 years now. And that means some of these Republican governors need to sit down with the other side, which they don't seem to be capable of doing, and working out some compromise, particularly on work rules, to let the folks who came hundreds and thousands of miles for a better life to actually get to work and bolster our economy and earn enough money to buy more than a tent outside a police station.
Let me ask you this. I heard someone the other day talk about how 20,000 people came from Ukraine after the war started to Chicago. I haven't seen any of that talked about, but how they got incorporated, if that number is true or even if it's smaller. But we had a lot of people coming from the Ukraine, and I think that there probably is an established Ukrainian community that would have helped absorb that. Do you have any insight on that or any awareness around that?
Well, there are some Ukrainian pockets. In fact, our state representative, Mike Quigley, was chair of a caucus representing Ukrainians, and he was a single vote in a piece in Congress. So 2 weeks ago, single Democrat who voted against that particular continuing resolution because it didn't deal with funding further support of Ukraine. So there's a significant Ukrainian population here. And yes, I don't know what the numbers are. 20,000 sounds high, but it could have reached that. But I know people who were doing one-on-one help, families of 3 or 4 supporting one family at a time to get settled. And that's wasn't just with Ukrainians. It was happening also with Afghanis and other migrants, if you will, from other war-torn areas. So our city, in fact, has had a history. And for those who don't want us to continue that kind of welcoming city thing, it's not in our history. It's not really in our genome, I think, to reject folks who come to our shores of Lake Michigan to try to make a better life for themselves.
Well, yeah, we're going to be watching this. I'm sure we'll be involved in some ways.
I appreciate, I'll say that, if your kids' soccer practice is taken away because a field house has been turned over to emergency migrant centers, why you're going to be upset. And it's hard for people, parents in particular, in that particular situation, to maybe take the long view. But the city is hard pressed. I'm afraid they've been a little flat-footed so far in their moves to kind of cope with a unplanned crises. I don't mean that as a criticism, except I think some more creativity needs to be coming forward, as well as definitely more resources from somewhere.
Well said. Yeah, I was really glad when our governor basically questioned the idea of the tents. not just because of Hance and Cole, but partly because of who the company is that's been doing the busing from Texas and Florida, those kind of places. How about we switch gears here?
Sure.
Originally, when I first said time to come on the show, Thom, you were going to talk about race and equity, a project you're involved with, and there was a certain timing issue on that. So here we are. We got the date right, I think. Come on and spill the beans. What's it all about, Thom?
Well, in the last 2 weeks, we have formally launched a project I've been working on for 3 years with a group of other journalists and educators called the Investigative Project on Race and Equity. And what we're trying to do is basically train journalists in data driven reporting and collaborate with news organizations to uncover systemic racism in our society through compelling stories, human interest stories that inform the public discourse and hopefully create change. We feel that's important because an informed populace and policymakers might make better choices about how we solve some of these problems. And in this case, we released a report in conjunction with WBEZ Public Radio, also appearing in the Chicago Sun-Times, on 42 million records that the state has collected from police departments all around the state on traffic stops. The reason the state was collecting this data is that a young state senator by the name of Barack Obama, in an earlier era, 20 years ago, was trying to stem the tide of what was seen as perhaps prejudicial stops by police. And what's happened in the meantime seems to indicate, as a result of our reporters' analysis, is that the problem really hasn't gone away. In fact, for Black drivers, it's probably gotten worse. Um, the particular findings show that stops involving Black drivers top 30% of all traffic stops statewide. That's up from 17% in 2004. That trend is disturbing, and we have tried to document what might be going on in order that we might be able to find a better solution to what seems to be a particular issue that befalls Black and Latino drivers around the state. This is not just a city of Chicago issue, although we probably have had time to do more particular analysis, and the stories, which are available at WBEZ.org or our own raceandequityproject.org, will give you the links to find the 3-part series and another one coming along. It includes an interactive database where people can look up community by community what their particular statistics are. Again, to try to help not just Chicagoans, but communities around the state figure out if they have a problem, and if so, what they need to do about it.
Why do you think that there have been more stops of Black and Latino drivers? Do we have any indication of what it might be when we have more attention being paid to, people they have dash cameras, they have cameras they wear, there's much more oversight, there's a lot of talk about it. What do you think the causes of the increase in these stops?
Well, that would be conjecture on my part. What the data shows is that there has been an increase in Black drivers being stopped. What's interesting is that probable cause is supposed to be one reason for a traffic stop, but in many cases, even non-moving violations, when analyzed, show far more Black drivers being stopped than, a tail light is out, or you have jiggly dice in your windshield hanging from your rearview mirror. Those are considered non-moving violations, but they seem to have prompted an increase in number of police stops, particularly if you're driving while Black.
You had said something about stop and frisk being outlawed to me in a conversation. Does that relate in any way?
Our report did not address that issue. It could be something that happens down the line as other reporters take a look at our data, or for that matter, other policymakers take a look at the results of our data. The fact is that even beyond the city limits, traffic stops are disproportionately affecting Black drivers. Black drivers only make up 13% of overall drivers, but they make up 21% of all traffic stops throughout the state. Again, this is a statewide issue that what we've identified. It's not just particular to Chicago. Um, I will leave it to the policymakers and legislators as well as the public uh, to delve into this data further to figure out what some of the solutions might be.
Tom, do you have any more about the project on race and equity? You want to share where it's going, what the plans are?
Well, we're very excited to have finally launched, and we're looking forward to begin offering training programs. We actually hired 3 apprentices to work with our 2 lead reporters and the WBEZ staff to help crunch these numbers. We're very excited we were able to engage these young reporters to teach them some basic investigative skills involving data. Um, we hope to be offering further trainings over the next couple of months. Um, we are very grateful for the funding we've gotten so far. You know, I always have to thank our funders. The Chicago Community Trust gave us a big boost last January with a significant grant. We've also had support from the Joyce Foundation, the Field Foundation, and the Chicago Headline Club. Um, there's no doubt that our affiliate, that the collective experience of the 12 to 14 members of the advisory committee who've really volunteered many hours, meeting almost weekly on Saturday afternoons to pull this effort off. Um, that kind of talent will be contributing to these trainings and to moving the work of this project forward.
Well, we're going to run out of time, but I want to make sure everyone they can go to raceandequityproject.org
Correct.
for more information.
Exactly.
And I'm going to throw one more question at you. What's the latest status of Chicago newspapers? And I guess where I'm going is, what do you think about public radio buying the Sun-Times and the Sun-Times coming out with really some good news and reporting? You got anything you want to share on that?
Well, I think you summed it up rather well. I think that the partnership between WBEZ, Chicago Public Media, and the Chicago Sun-Times is both part of a trend of legacy newspapers turning to the nonprofit business model. It is still an evolving business model. After all, being nonprofit is just a tax status. It's not how you run your business. But I think Chicago readers and viewers and listeners have been enriched by the partnership so far. I think it has helped both those media outlets tremendously. And to be honest, while the Tribune still produces some good reports, I believe the Sun-Times is the more important newspaper now if you want to follow local news.
This has been good, Tom. Is there anything that you want that's not coming up on your mind you want to share, or you want to say you had enough of me today?
I've always enjoyed talking with you, Michael, and this again has been a very rich conversation. I look forward to listening to your next guest, Corky Siegel. I think is going to be celebrating a little bit of a birthday.
Yeah, he's getting up there. It's going to try to catch up to me.
I would invite people to check out raceandequityproject.org, the investigative project on race and equity, which you can also find on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and a little bit on that thing we used to call Twitter.
I'm looking forward to seeing you around the neighborhood, talking to you more, and know that you're always welcome to host an edition of this show, and you can certainly help write any of the script that you used to do all the time. Now I have to do it. But I appreciate your help and your support. You're a wonderful guy.
Take care, Michael.